What's going on, Babylonians? It's me, Songs of Rays, and I am back with some more Diablo 4 content to bring to you. Now, today is going to mark the special occasion of my first Season 1 Rogue actual build, and the reason why is because we did release a video last week, and I was explaining one of my favourite interactions that happens in Season 1 for the Rogue, and a few of you people just mentioned that you wanted to see the build guide for it, so here I am, I'm actually going to put a video together for it. So in this video, we're going to be discussing the skill tree, what I've managed to choose for my aspects, what I've currently got going for my Paragon board, and what I'm expecting will happen once I take this into World Tier 4. I'm expecting this to be absolutely fine for World Tier 4. Just note as a caveat that I haven't taken it in just yet, purely because I'm only level 60, and once the grind is there, I will be taking it over there, and I will give you an update if something does need changing. But of course, if you do enjoy this build, if you learn something useful with ourselves, then make sure to drop that like and subscribe. We are pushing for that 5k sub goal for the end of the year, so anything you can do would be massively appreciated. As with our other builds, there will be a pinned written guide for this build, so if you want to be able to see a visual guide of it at the same time as listening along to this video, that would then be able to head yourself over there, click on the link, and it will take you to everything you possibly could need to know. But with all that said and done, what are we waiting for? Let's finally dive into the build. Alright, so first and foremost, we always start with the skill tree, and this is going to be no different. So let's be honest, we're going to head ourselves up here, and we're going to start off with our basic skills. Now, we are going to need a basic skill for this build, and where else are we going to turn to other than Puncture? Puncture is absolutely god tier in terms of when it comes to basic skills for the Rogue, and it pretty much is the be-all and end-all when you need to choose one. This is going to give us some ways to stack up our combo points, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. It's a great way of being able to deal damage at a bit of a range, and it's also a great way to apply vulnerable, while also giving us some extra kind of energy on top of it. Probably the best one out of all the options in terms of being able to get our energy back. So we have gone for 1 point into Puncture, 1 point into Enhanced, giving us extra energy with crowd control enemies, which is going to be the main bread and butter of this build. And we also have 1 into Fundamental, meaning that we're throwing out 3 blades instead of just the 1, and allows us to be able to apply vulnerable for 2 seconds once we hit an enemy with 2 blades. So moving swiftly on from there, we do go into our core skills, and this is where our damage is going to kind of start to excel. The reason why is we have 5 points into Penetrating Shot, and where we fire an arrow that pierces through all enemies in a line, and it also gets increased with combo points. But the reason why this has had a boost, the reason why I like Penetrating Shot so much in this build, is because combo points also gives us extra lucky hit chance, and that does mean that we can more reliably use some of the lucky hit modifiers that we do have in this build. It's also going to help us out with some of the other interactions that we do have in the build in terms of aspects and Malignant Hearts, so that's also something else to factor in as well. So we have 5 points into this, we have 1 point into Enhanced, meaning that our Penetrating Shot will deal 10% increased damage per enemy it pierces, and 1 into Improved Penetrating Shot, meaning if we damage at least 3 enemies with the ability, our next one is going to have a 20% increased critical strike chance. This is going to be helpful not only because we're going to use this to heal, but we're also going to be using it as a way to increase the amount of damage we can do, and that's going to be through the use of our Malignant Hearts, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. We do have 1 point into Sturdy, giving us some close damage reduction, because I do like using this build in close range. But if you do find that you don't use this in close range, if you do find that you not really getting the full benefit of these 4 points, feel free to move them about as you see fit, maybe go into some extra damage, or maybe some increases into our Imbuements. But we have 1 point into Sturdy and 3 points into Siphoning Strikes, which did have the change for on a lucky hit. Critical strikes will gain against close range enemies, have a 75% chance to heal us for 3% of our maximum life. It gives us a little bit of sustain, it means we don't have to rely on our potions as much, and it just kind of helps us out with some of those fights. Moving on from there though, we do go into our agility tree, and we're going to use our main way of being able to get out of crowd control ourselves, and that's going to be Shadow Step. This allows us to be able to become unstoppable, it allows us to get some extra movement speed afterwards, and it also does some damage, but also it gives us an extra 100% lucky hit chance when we hit with this, meaning that if we do crit, we get a heal, if we we have a chance of being able to apply some of our lucky hit modifiers as well, so Shadow Step is a really nice ability to have. We take this a little bit further because we have 1 point into Enhanced, meaning that we have an increased critical strike chance against enemies we hit with this by 8% for 3 seconds, and 1 point into Disciplined, meaning our cooldown is reduced by 3 seconds once it damages an enemy that we've not hit in the last 4 seconds with this ability. Because we don't have the cooldown low enough and just yet, it does mean that we get to cut this down from 8.36 seconds all the way down to 5.36 seconds. Now in this build we're going to test out a different ability that we've not used before in any of the other guides that we've used that we've done so far on the channel, and that's going to be Caltrops. Caltrops is going to be especially useful in this build, mainly because it's a great way of doing some crowd control, it's a great way of being able to spread some status effects, and it's also going to work really nicely with our key passive. The reason why is because this is a trap ability that has a lucky hit chance in of itself, so it has a chance of being able to trigger those for us as well. But what we'll do is it leaps backwards, we throw Caltrops on the ground, dealing a decent amount of damage, and it also makes a slow field for 50% that lasts 6 seconds for any enemies that walk within those Caltrops. We take this a little bit further by going into Enhanced, meaning that any enemies that are inside the Caltrops field of range, they have a take 3% increased damage for each second they stay in. So because Caltrops stays on the floor for 6 seconds, this means we can get a maximum of 18% increased damage modifier, which is overall kind of nice to have. Now it's vitally important that we do go for the next point into Methodical, because what this does is it changes Caltrops into cold damage, and it will now chill enemies that are caught within the field for 25% per second. This isn't going to be very obvious right off the bat, it's going to make more sense once we get to the aspects, but it is vitally important with this build that Caltrops can now do cold damage and chill enemies. So definitely keep that in the back of your mind once we get a little further into this guide, but overall this is absolutely must have to have in this build. But before we move on, we do have 3 points into Weapon Mastery, one that pretty much have every single rogue build to have. So therefore, because we have 3 points and we are using crossbows for our penetrating shot, it does mean we have a 15% increased critical strike damage modifier, which is very, very tasty and very, very nice. So that wraps it all the way up for our agility trees, allows us to move to our subterfuge skills, and we're going to be picking up our personal favourite, the poison trap. How this one works is that we place a trap that arms after 1.25 seconds, dealing a decent chunk of poison damage over 9 seconds to enemies within an area, but we're also taking that a little bit further with 1 point into Enhanced, meaning that we knock down enemies that are caught within the trap for 1.67 seconds, and we also have 1 point into Countering, meaning we have a 30% chance to reset our Imbuement skill cooldowns once the trap gets activated. The reason we've gone for this is because our Imbuement skill is our main damage dealer when it comes to this build, so therefore trying to get this back as fast as possible is kind of the name of the game. It's also the fact that we can put down through the use of our key passive Poison Trap ridiculously quick, so meaning we can cut their cooldowns down massively with how this build kind of works, and it means that we can just consistently keep putting out Poison Traps every couple of seconds, and we have a 30% chance each time it gets activated to instantly reset that skill cooldown. So eventually it will actually proc, it's basically the name of the game with that one. Now we are also going into one of my personal favourites when it came to the barrage build that we've done before, and that's going to be using Dark Shrouds. Now we aren't putting the skill on our skill bar, we are purely going into this for the extra free Dark Shrouds that we will be getting from using Marksman skills, and it just gives us some extra bonus utility for when those Dark Shrouds do appear. So how this one works is we've got 1 point into here, we've got another couple from our gear, and it means that we do have an 8.8% damage reduction per active shadow that we have going. On top of this, we have 1 point into Enhanced, meaning that our Dark Shadows have a 14% chance to not be consumed when they take damage, and we have 1 point into Countering, meaning that while we have 4 active shadows at least active at the same time, we gain an 8% increased critical strike chance. This goes really nicely and hand in hand with the rest of the build, because we want to get our critical strike chance as high as possible, because it's going to work really nicely with one of the aspects in the build. Before we do move on though, we do have our 3 points into Exploit and 3 points into Malice, allowing us to do extra damage to injured, healthy and vulnerable enemies respectively, but also you can see that I do have 2 points into Exploit from our gear, and that's going to be over on our amulet. In terms of the best rolls to get on your amulet, we will discuss that a little bit later on, or just touch on it again. It's going to be best to go into Exploit, or it's going to be best to go into Frigid Finesse for the maximum amount of damage that you could possibly eke out of this build. So there we go, that's the Subterfuge. We can move once again down the rest of the skill tree, and that brings us down to the Imbuements. With this one, we are looking to purely go into our Cold, and this allows us to be able to do the majority of the interactions that this build does, meaning that we're going to stop enemies from being able to move, from being able to attack, and then we get the massive damage multipliers that Cold Imbuement does bring to the table, meaning we can do some insane damage and DPS. So we've gone for 1 point into Cold Imbuements, the rest is from our gear on our heads. In terms of like extra points on this, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. The extra kind of percentage on like chill that you can do is kind of negligible. It doesn't really reduce the amount of hits you have to be able to land to get that freeze, and the freeze interaction isn't going to be coming from hitting multiple enemies with the same skill over and over again, so therefore it's kind of a bit of a waste to have the extra rolls into Cold Imbuement with this build. But we do have 1 point into this regardless. We have 1 point into enhanced, meaning that on a lucky hit, because of how the ability will be working, it's almost guaranteed on a lucky hit, so we just have to worry about that 40%. Means our cold imbued skills have a 40% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. Keep in note that this will be for every single enemy that we do hit with our penetrating shot, and because of how the aspects are lined up, we are going to have it so that we can split out extra arrows, meaning that multiple enemies are going to be hit at the same time, all having a 40% chance to instantly be made vulnerable. We then also have 1 point into mixed, and this is where we're going to have the big, one of the big damage multipliers in the build. So our cold imbued skills will deal 20% damage to crowd control enemies, which is going to be pretty much all the time, especially with the traps that we do have. And we double this bonus against frozen enemies, so once we do get them frozen, that is going to be 40% increased damage, which is absolutely massive and huge. Keep in mind that if you do use Cold Imbuement, if you don't do any kind of setup whatsoever with the traps, if you cast your Cold Imbuement and you hit an enemy, because of the chill, because that counts as a crowd control, that does mean that your next attack will then do that 20% extra damage once you use the second cast of your Cold Imbuement. So before we move on, we do have 3 points put into our personal favourite, which is Frigid Finesse, meaning we deal 15% increased damage to chilled enemies, and this bonus increases all the way up to 30% against frozen enemies, which is absolutely massive. And as you can see, between these two modifiers alone, being able to go against frozen enemies, we have 30% from Frigid, we have 40% from Mixed, and that is 70% increased damage just from those two alone, which is absolutely insane and allows us to hit those damage numbers that you've seen on the screen. We also have 3 points into Precision Imbuements. This means our imbued skills have a 9% increased critical strike chance. Pretty much what it says on the paper, so it does what it says on the tin, and overall it's just really nice consistency. So that allows us to move down to our ultimate tree, and we don't pick up an ultimate skill. Now you can mess about with Death Trap in this, but personally I found that Caltrops and Poison Trap, once they're set up correctly in terms of like aspects, is actually the best. Death Trap's kind of nice in terms of, especially if you do go for Prime, I mean that you can pull enemies into a certain area, and penetrating shot is going to affect a lot of enemies, but because of the cooldown, because it doesn't offer any extra utility, I still think that Caltrops is better, and I still think that Poison Trap is just king when it comes to being able to reactivate some of your abilities and get your imbuements back faster. So what we don't do is we don't go for that. We do have 3 points into Trap Mastery, meaning when our Poison Trap is activated, we gain 12% increased critical strike chance against vulnerable and crowd control enemies for 4 seconds. Overall pretty huge. We have 3 points into Innovation, allowing us to have a chance to gain free energy just from casting our skills. And we have 3 points into Alchemist's Fortune, meaning that our non-physical damage we deal has a 15% increased lucky hit chance. How this one's going to work, especially once we combine it with Penetrating Shot, is that a base Penetrating Shot is 50%. If you have 3 combo points, this does go all the way up to 80%, and the game does show you this in-game as well. So at 80% increased lucky hit chance right there, it's fairly consistent already. But if you then go and use your Cold Imbuement, and then you use your the Alchemist's Fortune, that is additive 15%, meaning that we go from 80 all the way up to 95%. I know we had a couple of people mention in the comment section they didn't think that's quite how that works, but from my research online, because it has a plus sign and it's not a times or anything like that, it is additive, so it goes from 80% all the way up to 95%, which is pretty much almost there to be able to guarantee that 100%. Now, you can have a multiplier if you do get a roll on your gear that does go into lucky hit chance. That is multiplicative, meaning that you can push this over 100%, and then obviously you then have that consistency, what the build kind of needs. So that wraps up in terms of lucky hits. So then we go down onto the bottom, we do have 1 point into Adrenaline Rush. Overall, not really needed for the build, but it does give us some extra energy regen when we move. And 3 points into Haste, meaning that we get increased movement speed or increased attack speed, depending on if we're above or below 50% energy. So the last point does go into our key passive, and this one I've had a lot of fun messing about with. Now, you could make an argument for precision, because of how the Malignant Hearts is going to line up. You do some extra critical strike damage, you have some ways to guarantee critical strikes, which is really nice. But me personally, while precision wasn't a bad shout, because I am using Puncture, and both of them, both Puncture and Penetrating Shot are counted as marksman skills, it does mean that you're then competing with Puncture for setting up your combo points, and you might need to try out a different ability. So therefore, because of that, precision doesn't quite work out the way I kind of need it to, especially for this build. So instead, I have been messing about with exposure. How this one works is that a lucky hit dealing direct damage to an enemy affected by a trap skill, so this is going to be our Caltrops and our Poison Trap, has a 25% chance to reduce the active cooldowns of our trap skills by 20%, and drop a cluster of exploding stun grenades dealing 40% 20% of our damage, or as physical damage, and stun enemies for 0.5 seconds is another form of crowd control. These grenades are actually going to come massively in handy once we look into the aspects of the build, but keep in mind that we're reducing our cooldowns. We're intending to keep enemies within our trap skills, our trap area of effect, which is very obvious on the screen, and then we're able to do some extra damage with stun grenades, but then we'll also get some extra utility out of that as well. So let's quickly shift on over to our Paragon tree. Let's discuss my current choices and what I intend to do going forward. So as you can see on the starting tree, I have gone for the right to increase the amount of damage that we have. And then eventually I will move up to the middle and then grab into a glyph socket. Now in this one I do have control. Control gives us a massive damage boost to crowd control targets, and especially that additional bonus where it gives us a multiplier for increased damage to slow, chilled enemies, or instead 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen. That 20% is massive as well, considering that we drop stun grenades that will be stunning enemies all the time. That means we're getting 20% increase to them even if we aren't getting the enemies frozen, and therefore even if they are frozen we still get that massive damage output. So as it currently stands, I do have it at 48.1% increased damage to crowd control enemies, and then I deal an extra 10 or 20% damage on top of that as well. So moving on from that node, as you can see I have picked up the intelligence where I can, and then I will pick up a few more nodes to increase the amount of damage I will get once I do increase its radius, once I meet the actual like the leveling requirement to be able to do so. But I head up on the left hand side, pick up the extra damage from Skillful, go into the next board. The next board I do pick up the Imbuement board. I think this is the best one to be able to get some instant kind of like extra damage. And as you can see I've headed over to the left, picked up some extra damage to imbued and non-physical damage, and then picked up the legendary node which is Eldritch Bounty. From here, I'm intending to move all the way up to the left-hand side, go to the board attachment gate, and then head on over to Cheap Shot. Cheap Shot will then give me the extra damage to crowd control enemies, which I'm going to be doing anyway, and as you can see with my glyph, when it comes to control, it makes the most sense. In terms of like rotations, in terms of the board, I would probably recommend something like this, or maybe another 180, so that this one's the other side. But ideally, what you want to do is work your way straight across the board, and what you do is you pick up these yellow nodes, and you also pick up the extra glyph socket, and you also pick up the legendary node, so you kind of do like a branch like this. I will eventually flesh it out, but that's how I'm intending for it to work. In terms of the glyph node that you want to slot into there, you want to try out this one, Snare. Snare will be so that the initial like damage, the bonus that you're going to get from intelligence is not really kind of necessary. It's nice to have some extra damage to our trap skills, but that's not the real selling point we want it for. The real reason we want it is the additional bonus, meaning our non-ultimate trap skills will have a 25% increased radius. This means our Caltrops is going to kind of almost fill the screen. It's kind of crazy how big that actually does get. And then our Poison Trap gets a bigger radius as well. But this works in tandem with the rest of the skill tree. And as you can see with our exposure, we're only getting the benefit once an enemy is within that trap or if they've been affected by it. And so the idea is that the bigger area that we can get, the more enemies that are in that area, the more enemies we're going to affect with our key passive at the same time, meaning more rolls, more damage, etc, etc. So that's how the tandem, how the synergy with that is going to work, and that's what I intend to do. So that allows us to move on to our specialization real quick, and that's going to be combo points. We've already talked about how this one kind of works, but the idea is we use our puncture, we build up our 3 points, and then we cast it with our penetrating shot. That gives us our best lucky hit chance. It also gives us the best damage as well. And as you can see, the percentages of in terms of like how much damage you deal with a single cast once you have your combo points to max is just pretty insane. And then that allows us to be able to scale it even higher once we have some extra gear. Speaking of gear, that allows us to move on over here. Now this build will work absolutely fine without any uniques whatsoever. You will notice that I have got a couple equipped, and I will explain those choices, but you do not need those at all. They're just purely, I've managed to get some good rolls, I've managed to find a couple out there in the wild, and I'm just trying them out just to see how they kind of perform. So let's move our way down, let's have a look through the aspects and explain a couple of choices, and we'll just kind of like touch on it from there. So in terms of the helmet, I have gone for Might on this one. I am messing about with this. I do think potentially, in terms of what's the best ones to be able to go for, I do think Disobedience might actually do something a little bit better, and I'm holding back on this until I get a better helmet for me to swap on. The reason why is because we are going to be doing loads of multiple hits, and that allows us to stack up Disobedience insanely. It's so easy in actual fact that Disobedience is probably one of the best in slots for this. So the idea is that Might is just kind of there for the time being, and then once I find a better helmet, I will be swapping that over. But in terms of rolls that you want on this, basic skill attack speed is kind of nice. It helps you set up your combo points a little faster. And we also have cooldown reduction. Those are the two main ones I would probably recommend. If you can get some health on kill, if you can get some extra ranks into something, feel free. But you don't need the extra ranks into Cold Imbuements. It's probably just better to get some extra stats. In terms of the chest piece, we have gone for Frostbitten, and this is the crucial one that you do need for this build. The only downside is that you can't find Frostbitten from any of the dungeons that I believe that I'm aware of, so you need to get a little bit lucky with these drops. How this works is that chilled enemies hit by your grenade skills have a chance equal to double your critical strike chance to instantly get frozen for 2 seconds. You also deal 21% increased critical strike damage against frozen enemies. How this one works is that it's all kind of like key in when you have a look at what's been highlighted in the sentence. So chilled enemies, we will be doing this in spades. We have Caltrops that's going to chill enemies. We've got Cold Imbuement that can chill if it doesn't hit enough enemies and everything like that. So we have multiple ways of being able to apply chill. We also have Penitent Greaves, but if you don't have the unique, you don't necessarily need it, but that's a third way of being able to apply it as well. Enemies that are hit by our grenade skills, and you'll notice that the word grenade is in white but skills is not. This is what's the important part about it, because it doesn't mean that you need to use one of the grenade skills, which is going to be Smoke Grenade. You don't need that. How this one kind of works is that anything that chucks grenades, so stun grenades, is going to apply this. That means that our exposure is going to be doing it. It does mean that with some of the aspects that we do have for like Caltrops can instantly freeze enemies because of this. We're going to have a Malignant Heart that's able to drop extra stun grenades. Essentially, it just means that we're going to always be dropping grenades on chilled or frozen enemies, and they all have a chance to instantly freeze those enemies for 2 seconds. This is also the important reason why we want our critical strike chance as high as physically possible, so that we're able to get this consistently and then take advantage of all those damage multipliers. Frostbitten is absolutely necessary in this build, and as soon as you find one, make sure you keep hold of it. It doesn't matter if it's a 10 to 25% roll, it can be as low as possible, but that instant freeze is what you're after, and that is just insane. Moving on there, the gloves, we do have Expectant. Attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of our next core skill cast by anywhere between 5 to 10% all the way up to 30. This goes hand in hand with combo point builds. It's just insane, it just gives us a nice extra damage multiplier, and 30% is not to be sniffed at. You also want some extra rolls into Penetrating Shot and Critical Strike Chance where you can with this build, and if you can get an attack speed, all the more for you. Moving on to the pants, we do have Umbrus, and this is going to be where we're getting our free Dark Shrouds. So on a lucky hit, our critical strikes with marksman skills have up to a 40 to 60% chance to grant us a free Dark Shroud Shadow. The more hits that we do with our penetrating shots, the more critical strikes we fire off once they branch out as well, the more Dark Shrouds we can get. I have seen me able to get instantly 4 to 5 Dark Shroud Shadows from one single cast of penetrating shot, so feel free to keep that in mind. Lastly, in terms of the armour, we do have the Penitent Greaves. You don't necessarily need these, you can use other boots. I was using these ones, which was using Frostbitten, and then I swapped one of the skills over to the chest piece. So you can use Might, you can use Disobedience at the same time if you do have a pair of boots that do also have Frostbitten on them, so don't feel like you need to have Penitent Greaves. But Penitent Greaves does give you that Frost Trail, which means you can chill enemies as standard, and you don't need to cast any of your abilities, and on top of that you also deal extra damage to chilled enemies. So that allows us to move on to the jewellery, and in terms of the amulet I do have Edgemasters. Now this one is pretty good because this allows us to deal extra damage based on our available primary resource once we cast the ability, and we receive the maximum benefit when we have full. This is going to work out really nicely with one of the rings, but ideally we want to have our energy as high as possible once we cast that penetrating shot so that we can deal even more damage. In terms of rolls that you're looking for this, Imbuement skill damage is huge, and extra ranks into Exploit or Frigid Finesse will do you wonders. In terms of the rings, we do have Tricksters, and Tricksters is also almost a mainstay compared to something like Frostbitten. The reason why is Caltrops now also throws a cluster of exploding stun grenades that deals damage, but it's also stunned grenades for stunned enemies for 0.5 seconds. The real reason we want this, and the damage roll once again does not matter with this, is because we are looking to be able to throw out those stun grenades, and those count for our Frostbitten, meaning that enemies that get hit by Caltrops, because the cold field goes down first, chilling enemies, and then the stun grenades have a throw time, meaning they land a little bit afterwards. Caltrops now has a way to instantly freeze enemies and makes it absolutely vital in this build. And for our other ring, we do have Ring of the Umbral. This is our way of being able to get our primary resource and works absolutely wonders once we combine it with Edgemasters. Because we are going to be crowd controlling enemies left, right and centre through the use of stun grenades, through our chill, through everything else. It's insane. It means we're going to be restoring a buttload of energy every single time we cast an ability, and means we're pretty much never really going to be running out of energy unless we're going up against a boss. In terms of rolls on this, we do want damage to Frozen, critical strike chance and critical strike damage with Imbued, damage to enemies affected by trap skills. There's a lot of good rolls for you in terms of rings. So any kind of mixture of those. Critical strike chance is going to be the most key because obviously that then feeds back into Frostbitten, giving you extra chance to instantly freeze enemies. But any kind of rolls or combinations of those four will be absolutely fine. In terms of the weapons, once again, we have gone for another unique, but that's because I'm messing about with it to see if it helps. It is giving me an extra damage increase, but to be honest with you, I'd much prefer a God-rolled sword. But having extra damage to close enemies through the Condemnation, and also our core skills deal extra damage when we have 3 combo points, which we're going to be doing almost all the time. And our basic skills using this weapon have a 30% chance to generate 3 combo points. For our other one, we do have accelerating on this, meaning our critical strikes with core skills increase our attack speed by 15 to 25% for 5 seconds. This helps us out with being able to get our combo points going a little bit faster once we land one of those critical strikes, but it also helps us with penetrating shot because the cast on that can be a little bit long sometimes, meaning that we want to be able to fire it out a little bit faster and then be able to start moving around again, being able to cast another one if we need to, everything like that. So having extra attack speed is really nice in this build. And in terms of like modifiers, critical strike damage is nice, vulnerable damage and damage to enemies affected by trap skills is kind of nice as well. Lastly, for our crossbow, we do have Trick Shot, meaning our penetrating shot damages an enemy. 2 additional arrows are split off to either side, and these arrows deal 20 to 50% of the penetrating shot's base damage. It would be nice to have a 50% on this, but the main reason you do go for this is so that you can do your trick shots to the side, because the arrow does more than enough anyway once you have this build set up correctly. In terms of rolls, you are looking for core skill damage. Dexterity is quite nice. Anything to Imbuements as well. Critical strike damage is also nice. Vulnerable damage, anything like that. This is not a god roll. I am looking for a better one. The only reason I've gone for this is because it was better than my other, and it also has some extra nice kind of stats in terms of like the core skill damage and the dexterity as well. In terms of Malignant Hearts, we've already gone through the jewelry, but let's have a quick look through what I've currently slotted in. In terms of my amulet, I'm not really a big fan of the one I currently have in. It's not offering me enough, so I am looking to be able to get a better amulet, and I am looking for a better slot. I don't think pink really helps us out too much. It's not a bad shout being able to have this so that you spend extra primary resource, and then we stun enemies for 3 seconds. It's not terrible, but I do think there's better ones out there, so feel free to be able to look out for that. We do also have some extra raffle hearts. This one's not a bad shout. We do also have one that allows us to get the benefit of all the imbuement skills all at the same time on a low chance. That one's not a bad shout either, so feel free to slot that in, and that can go into any slot whatsoever. But for our rings, we do want to be able to go for 2 orange slots. So we do have one so that we have extra lucky hit chance to be able to launch extra stun grenades that deal some physical damage and stun enemies. This works hand in hand once again with Frostbitten, meaning that our penetrating shot, once it's cold imbued, has a way to be able to instantly freeze enemies. So the cold effect will happen first, and then the stun grenades will land afterwards, meaning that we have that chance to be able to stun. One key thing to note on this one is that the amount of stun grenades that can be launched out will vary. You can get this as low as 2, I believe. 5 is the highest I've seen so far, and if you can get 5, essentially you want as high as possible with the amount of grenades you'll be throwing out, not the damage. So if you can get 5, all more power to you. That's definitely probably going to be one of the better ones to get. And then lastly, in terms of this one, we do have it so that we gain 60% increased critical strike damage, but our non-critical strikes damage deal 25% less damage. You definitely want to try and find as high as you can in terms of critical strike damage. Because of our critical strike kind of focus with this build, you will pretty much you're more likely going to be critting than not. So this will actually work out being better for you in the long run. But overall, this is definitely one of the better hearts to go for, and I highly recommend you try and find one to put in. So anyway, that pretty much wraps it up on the builds. Let me know in the comment section down below, what do you think? Like I said, this is only up to World Tier 3, but this will be absolutely fine going into World Tier 4. And if there is any changes that I do make, I will be swapping it over and making an updated video in the future. But as always, I'm always happy to receive some constructive criticism, so if you do have a change or something that could be better for me, let me know in the comment section down below. I will be going through those and having a read. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video. Massive thank you to the Babylonian family, as always, for their continued support. Really does help the channel out. And if you did enjoy this type of content, then make sure to drop a like and subscribe to get us ever closer to that 5k sub goal. But with all that said and done, that just leaves me to say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well, and I'll see you all on our next video.